There are moments on television that look ordinary until you understand what was happening behind them. A smile that holds a little too long, a pause that feels slightly heavier than it should, a voice that trembles for just a second before recovering. To most viewers, it's just personality, warm, expressive, relatable. But sometimes those small cracks are not performance at all. They are evidence of survival. This is the story of Kelly Clarkson during one of the most complicated chapters of her life. On the surface, she was thriving. A successful talk show host, a beloved singer, a mother balancing public life with private responsibilities. But behind the scenes, her personal world was unraveling in ways the public could not fully see. At the same time, other familiar names from the same entertainment world, Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani, were moving through their own transformations, finding new beginnings after painful endings. Their stories would eventually intertwine in unexpected ways, forming a contrast that makes Kelly's journey even more striking. This is not a story about celebrity, romance, or scandal. It's about emotional endurance, about what happens when a person is forced to rebuild identity while still showing up for millions of people every day, and about how healing sometimes looks less like rescue and more like solitude. A marriage that became a life system, not just a relationship by the time things began to fall apart. Kelly Clarkson's marriage to Brandon Blackstock was not just a romantic relationship. It had become a complete structure of life. He wasn't only her husband, he was also her manager, business partner, and the person involved in nearly every major decision she made professionally and personally. That kind of entanglement creates something difficult to separate later. Love becomes logistics, trust becomes infrastructure, and when cracks appear, they don't stay contained in one area, they spread into everything. Around 2019, the emotional distance between them reportedly became more noticeable. Not through dramatic fights or public conflict, but through silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than arguments because it signals emotional disconnection rather than temporary anger. When a relationship reaches that point, the confusion is often more painful than the conflict itself. There is no clear enemy, no obvious moment of collapse, just a growing realization that something essential no longer feels intact. And because their lives were so deeply interconnected, separation would not just mean emotional loss. It would mean untangling a shared existence built over years. The divorce that didn't feel like an event, but an unraveling when Kelly filed for divorce in 2020. It became public news quickly, but the reality behind it was not a single moment. It was a long, unraveling process, legal filings, custody arrangements, financial negotiations. All of it became part of a public narrative that reduced a deeply personal breakdown into headlines. But for Kelly, the emotional experience was not about media coverage. It was about identity collapse. When someone has been part of every layer of your life, separating from them doesn't feel like ending a relationship. It feels like losing the map of your entire world. She had once believed in permanence, in the idea that commitment meant stability, and stability meant safety. When that belief fractured, it wasn't just disappointment, it was disorientation. In interviews and quiet remarks, she expressed a sentiment that many people in long relationships eventually understand in their own way. She didn't expect it. Not like this, not after building so much of life around the idea of forever. And while public attention focused on financial settlements and custody discussions, the internal experience was something else entirely: grief mixed with confusion, and the slow realization that rebuilding would not be optional, the collapse behind the smile. When life stops matching the image, there are versions of people the public learns to recognize. For Kelly Clarkson, that version was warmth, humor, and a kind of emotional openness that made her feel familiar even to strangers. She could walk onto a stage or a talk show set and make it feel like nothing heavy ever touched her. But the reality of her personal life during the late 2010s and early 2020s did not match that image. Behind the camera, her marriage to Brandon Blackstock was becoming increasingly strained. What made the situation more complicated was how deeply embedded he was in her world, not only as her husband, but also as her manager and business partner. That kind of connection means separation is never just emotional, it is structural. It touches finances, schedules, decisions, and even identity. By the time the relationship reached its breaking point, it didn't erupt in public chaos. It dissolved through silence. Conversations became shorter, distance replaced clarity, and in relationships like that, silence often becomes the loudest warning sign. When the divorce became public in 2020, the world saw legal filings, financial discussions, and custody arrangements. But those external details only skimmed the surface. The deeper reality was emotional disorientation, trying to separate not just from a person, but from an entire life system that had been built over years. For Kelly, the collapse was not dramatic in a cinematic sense. It was slow, confusing, and deeply destabilizing. The hardest part wasn't the ending itself. It was realizing how much of her identity had been intertwined with something that was now gone. Parallel wounds, Blake Shelton, Gwen Stefani, and the geography of heartbreak around the same broader entertainment world, other familiar names were moving through their own emotional turning points. Blake Shelton had already experienced a highly public divorce from Miranda Lambert, a separation that came after years of being viewed as one of country music's strongest couples. What made Blake's experience significant wasn't just the breakup itself, but what followed. He openly described a period of emotional collapse, days that felt directionless, moments of isolation, and the disorienting feeling of losing not just a partner, but a shared identity. Gwen Stefani's story carried a different but equally intense emotional weight. Her marriage to Gavin Rossdale ended after more than a decade, bringing with it the collapse of what had once appeared to be a stable family life. She later expressed how deeply unsettling it was to have her private world shift while still being expected to appear composed in public. When Blake and Gwen eventually connected through their work on The Voice, their bond did not begin as a dramatic turning point. It grew from shared recognition, two people who understood what it meant to rebuild after emotional loss. Their relationship eventually became public and stable, evolving into marriage and a blended family structure. It represented a kind of mutual recovery, where healing happened alongside someone who understood the same emotional language of loss. But while their story moved toward shared rebuilding, Kelly Clarkson's path moved in a different direction. There was no parallel romantic figure stepping into her rebuilding process, no co-survivor of emotional collapse sitting beside her through the same timeline. That contrast matters not because one story is better, but because it highlights two very different forms of healing, one shared, one solitary. Rebuilding alone, Kelly Clarkson's quiet reinvention of self while others around her were entering new relationships or rebuilding with partners, Kelly Clarkson was rebuilding without that external anchor. Her life did not pause for recovery. Instead, it continued in full visibility. She launched and expanded The Kelly Clarkson Show, stepping into a role that required daily emotional presence. Every episode demanded energy, consistency, and warmth, even on days when her private life was under strain. That contrast between public expression and private experience became one of the defining features of this period. Her music performances on the show added another layer to that experience. Songs that once existed as entertainment pieces began to feel like emotional reflections. Viewers started noticing that her voice carried more than melody. It carried lived experience. The emotional tone of her performances suggested someone processing life in real time, not just performing it. At the same time, her divorce proceedings added legal and financial pressure. Reports of significant support, payments, and custody arrangements became part of public discussion, turning private restructuring into a widely analyzed narrative. Yet through it all, she maintained a consistent public stance. She did not turn her personal life into public conflict. What makes this period especially significant is not just what she endured, but how she responded. There was no public breakdown, no attempt to rewrite the story through blame. Instead, there was continuation work, parenting, performance, and gradual internal adjustment. Over time, changes became visible. A shift in environment, a focus on health, and a more grounded public presence suggested that something fundamental had shifted internally. She began speaking about releasing guilt, about accepting that endings do not always equal failure, and about recognizing that rebuilding is sometimes necessary rather than optional. Blake Shelton and the familiarity of emotional collapse around the same industry timeline. Blake Shelton had already experienced his own highly public breakup with Miranda Lambert. Their separation in 2015 shocked fans who had seen them as one of country music's most stable couples. Their relationship had been deeply intertwined with their professional identities, much like Kelly's marriage. When it ended, Blake later admitted to struggling significantly, emotionally and mentally, describing a period of isolation and disorientation. What makes emotional collapse so disorienting for public figures is that their professional lives continue regardless. Tours, recordings, appearances, all require functioning stability while personal stability is absent. Blake's experience became part of a larger emotional pattern that many entertainers quietly understand. Grief must often be carried privately while performance continues publicly. That familiarity with loss created an unspoken understanding later when he observed others going through similar experiences. Not intervention, not advice, just recognition. The awareness that heartbreak has recognizable silence, regardless of who is experiencing it. Gwen Stefani and the unexpected intersection of broken timelines. Gwen Stefani's separation from Gavin Rossdale added another layer to the emotional landscape unfolding within the same entertainment ecosystem. After more than a decade of marriage and 3 children, her divorce brought its own shock, particularly as it followed years of public image as a stable family unit. She later expressed how destabilizing it felt to have her personal life shift so drastically, while still maintaining professional visibility. That duality, public composure versus private collapse, is something many artists experience but rarely describe in full detail. When Gwen and Blake eventually began working together on The Voice, they were both in transitional emotional states. Their connection did not begin as a dramatic romantic shift, but as shared recognition of emotional exhaustion. What developed between them was slow, built on understanding rather than spectacle, 2 people recognizing familiarity in each other's rebuilding process. Their eventual relationship became a public symbol of second chances, but behind that symbolism was a quieter truth. Both had already experienced the kind of emotional breakdown that changes how trust is rebuilt. Kelly Clarkson's public strength and private collapse, while others around her were entering new relationships or rebuilding alongside partners, Kelly Clarkson was navigating her separation largely alone. Her public life, however, did not pause. In fact, it expanded. She launched and grew the Kelly Clarkson Show, stepping into a role that required daily emotional presence, warmth, and consistency. Every episode demanded energy that often contrasted with what she may have been experiencing privately. Her music segments became a defining feature of the show. Covers of well-known songs were not just performances, they often carried emotional undertones that viewers interpreted through the lens of her personal life. Audiences began to notice something subtle. Her performances felt layered with lived experience. Lyrics about love, loss, resilience, and longing took on additional meaning when delivered by someone going through visible life transition. Yet she continued showing up. Not because it was easy, but because routine often becomes a form of survival when everything else feels uncertain. The legal and financial weight of separation as the divorce proceedings continued, financial arrangements became part of public discussion. Reports of substantial monthly support, payments, and property-related disputes circulated widely, creating media narratives that often overshadowed the emotional reality behind them. For someone who had built her career from early struggle to global success, the financial aspect carried symbolic weight as well. It represented not just money, but a sense of control, fairness, and autonomy being negotiated externally. At the same time, custody arrangements added another layer of complexity. Parenting under legal structure is very different from parenting within a unified household. It requires scheduling life around documentation, agreements, and court decisions. Despite the public attention surrounding these details, Kelly largely refrained from engaging in public criticism or personal commentary about the process. That restraint shaped how the public perceived her, not as reactive, but as composed under pressure. Still, restraint does not mean absence of emotion. It often means containment. Performance as emotional translation during this period, Kelly's live performances began to take on a different emotional texture. Songs she had written years earlier about identity, relationships, family began to shift in meaning when performed during her talk show. One of the most powerful aspects of performance is that meaning is not fixed. A song written in one emotional state can transform entirely when performed in another life chapter. Audiences responded strongly to this shift. Many described her performances as emotionally raw, not because they were imperfect, but because they felt lived in. In particular, performances of deeply personal songs connected with viewers who were experiencing their own transitions, breakups, losses, reinvention. What made this significant was not just the artistry, but the transparency of emotion that could not be separated from real-life experience. It became less about entertainment and more about shared emotional expression. Blake and Gwen's stability versus Kelly's solitude, as Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani moved toward marriage and eventual family integration. Their public narrative shifted toward stability, and rebuilding together, their relationship became a visible example of healing through partnership. In contrast, Kelly Clarkson's journey did not include a public romantic counterpart during the same timeline. That difference created a stark emotional contrast in how their stories were perceived. Where one narrative showed shared healing, the other showed individual endurance. Neither path is inherently better or worse, but they are fundamentally different emotional experiences. Healing alongside someone allows for shared reflection. Healing alone requires internal negotiation without external emotional mirroring. Kelly's path demanded self-definition in real time, without waiting for relational resolution. That distinction is what makes her story resonate with many people, not because it is dramatic, but because it is solitary. Rebuilding identity through change and movement eventually, Kelly made visible changes in her life structure. She relocated her talk show, shifted environments, and made personal health decisions that reflected a broader focus on long-term well-being. These changes were not framed as reinvention for public image, but as adjustments needed for sustainability. Physical health, emotional clarity, and environmental change became part of a broader reset. She also spoke openly about releasing guilt tied to her marriage ending. That shift is significant because many people carry self-blame long after relationships end, even when outcomes are not singularly caused by one person. Letting go of that guilt allowed space for identity, reconstruction, not as someone who failed, but as someone who transitioned. Rebuilding, in this sense, was not about returning to a previous version of life. It was about building something entirely new. Conclusion: what remains when everything else is rebuilt? By the time her life stabilized into a new rhythm, Kelly Clarkson was no longer defined by a single role. Wife, contestant, pop star, talk show host, she had become something less easily categorized. A person who had lived through public and private collapse and continued forward without disappearing. Her story, when viewed alongside Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani's, reveals three different emotional outcomes from similar starting points of loss: partnership, reconstruction together, and reconstruction alone. None of these paths are simple. All of them require endurance. But Kelly's path carries a particular kind of weight because it lacks the visible support structure of a shared romantic recovery. Instead, it reflects something quieter but equally powerful: the ability to remain standing without external completion. In the end, her strongest chapter is not defined by awards, ratings, or public milestones. It is defined by continuity, by the decision to keep going when life no longer resembles what was once planned. And whether her best years are ahead or already unfolding, the answer may be less important than the evidence she has already given: that rebuilding a life does not always require another person. Sometimes it only requires the willingness to begin again,